The Supreme Court has just ruled on whether public money, taxpayer money, can go toward religious schools, or if tax credits could be used when it comes to religious schools. Now, this is a curious ruling, but unfortunately, the conservative judges, Supreme Court justices, I should say, ruled in favor of allowing religious schools to get this type of funding. So the controversy did stem from a program created by the Montana legislature back in 2015 that allowed residents to receive a tax credit up to $150 for a contribution to a scholarship program. And the state decided, well, we're not supposed to promote religion. We're not supposed to allow for public money to go toward religion. So as a result, we're gonna exclude religious schools. Well, this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court on Tuesday ruled in favor of parents in Montana seeking to use a state scholarship program to send their children to religious schools. The court said that a Montana tax credit program that directed money to private schools could not exclude religious schools. The 5-4 ruling was penned by Chief Justice John Roberts and joined by the court's 4 conservative justices. And Cenk, let me just give you an excerpt of the decision that Roberts wrote. He said, a state need not subsidize private education, but once a state decides to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they are religious. And then in the dissenting opinion, Justice Breyer wrote, if for 250 years we have drawn a line at forcing taxpayers to pay the salaries of those who teach their faith from the pulpit, I do not see how we can today require Montana to adopt a different view respecting those who teach it in the classroom.
Thoughts? Yeah, I actually think this is a hard case. So you know me, I'm very progressive on policy, but when it comes to the court, I'm mixed. And so here are the 2 conflicting issues. But they're both in the First Amendment. We have to make sure that we separate church and state, right? And so that would lean towards and not establishing a religion. That would lean towards not giving public money to a private religious school. On the other hand, we can't discriminate against religion. Well, that would lean towards, well, if non-religious people are getting it, religious institutions should be able to get it as well. So I don't think it's a clear-cut case. But in this situation, it's the Montana Constitution that says more clearly that you are not allowed to give to these religious schools. So the Supreme Court is not just judging a federal law, they're overturning the Montana Supreme Court, saying what you're doing is so unconstitutional federally that we're gonna vitiate a part of your state constitution. And to me, that's a much higher barrier. And I don't think that they cleared that barrier in this case. I think it was 5 conservative religious justices who wanted to rule that way politically and found a way to do it.
What I have a problem with is that private schools, especially private religious schools, are held at a completely different standard compared to typical public schools, right? So for instance, at a public school, you can't teach classes that demonize gay people or members of the LGBTQ community. You can't do something that can be described as discriminatory, or for instance, we've done stories in the past of religious schools who get involved in the personal lives of their students and basically tell students that they're not allowed to have premarital sex, they're not allowed to do this, they're not allowed to do that because it goes along with their religion. And the reason why that type of behavior, or here's a perfect example. In the past, a lot of these religious schools have ended up firing educators after they find out the educator engaged in premarital sex or the educator happens to be gay. And the thing that has protected the schools from being able to do that is that they're not in any way publicly funded. Well, now that there is this element of public money, they should have to abide by the same rules that public schools have to abide by. That means you don't get to fire teachers because they happen to be gay, right? I mean, if it's a private school, then it gets to be treated as a private school, and they get to be as vicious, I guess, as they want to people who don't follow the rules and regulations of their religion. But if we're gonna have, public funds involved here. I just think that they need to be held to the same standard as public schools when it comes to those types of issues.
See, that's why we're gonna have an even bigger mess now, because a little while earlier, the Supreme Court ruled that you can't discriminate against people who are LGBTQ. But now these religious institutions can, so they're gonna get public money and be able to discriminate with it. But the Supreme Court ruled that that was unconstitutional. So I don't know how they're gonna resolve that. And so, look, I think that to the best of our abilities, we should treat religious and non-religious people the same. I really do believe that. I think conservatives are not crazy to think that. I think that's a perfectly legitimate point of view. But the problem is giving public money to people who discriminate with it against other members of the community and citizens. And so it's a tough case, but I really think, especially given how clear the Montana Constitution was, they should have just let it stand and not allowed for these schools to get the money.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that it was a bad ruling, and we'll see how this plays out in the future. But it sets a precedent. And one person who's definitely ecstatic about this is Betsy DeVos, who wants nothing more than to be able to defund public schools and funnel that money into private religious schools. She wants to completely dismantle the public education system, which she worked very hard to do in her own state of Michigan. And in regard to this ruling, she said the following: "This decision represents a turning point in the sad and static history of American education. And it will spark a new beginning of education that focuses first on students and their needs. I'm calling on all states to now seize the extraordinary opportunity to expand all education options at all schools to every single student in America." Now, keep in mind, there's no discussion about increasing taxes in order to ensure there's enough funding to keep these schools afloat or these school districts afloat. What this essentially means is what little resources public schools have now could be shared with religious schools that aren't held to any particular standard, whether it comes to discriminatory practices or the curriculum.
Yeah, well, it's Betsy DeVos's dream come true. She's less concerned about constitutional principles than I am. She was very clear from the get-go, let's just give it to the religious. Okay, let's give it to the religious schools. Who gives a damn who they discriminate against? So that's the only thing she cares about other than her money and funneling a lot of the public money to private schools who are her friends and partly how she got her 10 yachts. So, and remember, one other thing about this is, yes, it's about religion in particular, but DeVos loves pushing private schools, not just because she's a religious zealot, but also because it means it goes to the money, the funding goes to other private schools that she's aligned with financially. So for her, it's a massive win-win because it allows discrimination and corruption. When you sign up for a spend and save account at aspiration.com/TYT, we will plant 10 trees. Let's save the planet together.